Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Jacob Williams. You are most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, Paul, and good to be here again. Great to connect with you and to see everyone.
Thank you. It's really great having you back. For those who don't recall from last time, Jacob is an Oxford PhD candidate in political theory, where he is researching the post-liberal movement and its critique of the liberal regime. He has published academic work on religion, conservatism, and Western culture, and his commentary has appeared in First Things, the American periodical, The Imaginative Conservative, The Critic, and elsewhere. He's also the director of domestic policy at Pickthall House, a UK think tank aiming to improve relations between Muslim communities and the West, alongside addressing other policy challenges. And I'll put links to those in the description below. Now, recently, a fascinating article by Jacob caught my attention. It's entitled "The Rise of Woke. Is Kaufman's Account the Best?" And I'm just going to share the screen so people can have a look at this fascinating article. Here we go. So here we have the article. Is published in the National Association of Scholars. Article by Jacob. The Rise of Woke. Is Kaufman's Account the Best? And this is a review of a book called The Third Awakening. Not The Third Awakening, Third Awakening, as a deliberate play on words there, by Eric Kaufman, who's actually a professor at the University of Buckingham, I think, in England, having been at Birkbeck College in London for some time. And the book was published earlier this year. And Jacob writes, I'm just going to read the first paragraph. Jacob says, writing about woke, in scare quotes, like disliking face masks or thinking only men have penises, immediately marks you with the stigmata of being right-wing. The fact that no neutral term exists for the subject of Eric Kaufman's new book, The Third Awakening, itself supports his preferred explanation of woke, which locates the genesis of this bizarre ideology in the usually unexamined taboos of progressive polite society, rather than the ideas of a cabal of Marxist revolutionaries plotting to overthrow America. So it's a very interesting and slightly provocative beginning there to your review. So perhaps you'd like to just give us a brief introduction to the topic, Jacob.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would probably just say, for the benefit of viewers in the UK, the book, The Third Awakening, is the US title. So in the UK, it's called Taboo, How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution, just in case anyone can't find it.
Yeah, indeed.
So, yeah, woke is a topic that we hear about in news in many ways. And it's often very unclear what it means. As I said in that article, there isn't really any neutral way of talking about the subject, which is itself a problem. But I think we can start with Kaufman's definition. We can do a lot worse than beginning with what he says woke is, which is the sacralization of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. So it's treating groups or group identities that were in the past genuinely mistreated, marginalized in various ways, and in some respects may still be marginalized in various ways, treating those identities as sacred, which means that they're treated as though they have a kind of religious value, as though they're holy, as though their value is incommensurable, it can't be measured or weighed up against anything else, and as though anything that appears to express the wrong view about those groups is a kind of blasphemy. So it's not just that it's false, it's that it is intrinsically an evil thing to say, and therefore a person who has the wrong view on gender or race or sexuality is a kind of morally corrupt just for having that view. Their ideas can't be engaged with as ideas that may be true or false. They have to be seen as akin to the desecration of a religious text, and therefore shut down where possible or ignored if they can't be shut down. So woke tends to lend itself to an attitude of censoriousness, of so-called cancel culture, trying to shut down debate, and it leads to a very narrow range of opinions on these topics being acceptable, and to a very highly emotionally fraught attitude that tends to produce a kind of culture of vulnerability and trauma.
Mm-hmm. So why does this matter so much to Muslims, but particularly? I mean, because this is very much kind of Western preoccupation. So Is this something we can ignore? Is it going to impact us as well?
Yeah, so I think it's very important for Muslims to understand this issue and that we have a lot of stake in it. So there are some who will say, well, this is a sort of culture war issue between Christians and secularists or whatever, but it's not at all the case that it's limited and will not affect Muslims. So to give just one really important way in which it will impinge on Muslims. So there's a law being proposed in the UK. I don't think it's actually been passed yet, but I've written about it when it was proposed previously to ban so-called anti-LGBT conversion therapy. Now, this bill is not targeted at obviously abusive therapies that should be banned. It's targeted at, in the words of its own proponents, casual conversations and private prayer. Now, this is an example of woke having really material consequences for basic religious freedoms that will affect Muslims, because although the people who are proposing this have in their mind that they're going to be targeting conservative Christians what they see as bigots in Christian churches, if this bill is passed, it could potentially mean, of course, there will be room for courts to interpret it in a less draconian way, but it could potentially mean that if someone, says to a religious leader, an imam, for example, that they think they might be gay, and they tell that person, well, it's better to try to restrain yourself and not follow that or practice celibacy, and this is exactly what's happened in Victoria, Australia, they could be in breach of the law. So this is an incredible restriction of religious freedom. It's driven, I think, not wholly, but in large part by woke attitudes, by what Abdul Hakim Murad calls coercive liberalism, which is very closely linked to woke. And so when you have this attitude that the LGBT community is sacred and expressing the wrong view on anything that impinges on that community is blasphemy, then it's very easy to think, well, the religious liberty or the freedom of speech to have your own view on human sexuality is not a valuable freedom, and we can just trample over it in a draconian way. This will affect Muslims, and it does affect Muslims.
Of course, and obviously Christians as well, and
Yes,
others.
absolutely.
But there's a paradox here, is there not? Now, it's not a view I subscribe to, but many people on the right, you see this on social media, do say that Muslims actually are a protected minority. They're privileged. You can't criticize Islam publicly. Now, I know we may think, well, this is bizarre, but nevertheless, people do say this.
Yes.
If that is a popular belief, then how does this all make sense? Because why aren't Muslims then a protected minority who are somehow exempt from being forced with the force of law to not speak of these LGBT issues in ways that are irreconcilable with liberalism? So are Muslims, or are they not, a privileged minority that such we can't touch them, so to speak, in the public domain?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. And two things we should clarify. So the first one is that woke isn't necessarily internally consistent. So Kaufman describes it as moral topography. So or an emotional moral topography. So it isn't primarily like a system of ideas that can be rendered internally coherent, although some people, of course, try, various critical theorists. But these theories really are mostly just being produced after the fact to kind of rationalize an emotional attitude. Now, they're rarely followed through in all their details either. And of course, most people who are woke don't read this stuff in depth. So what's really going on is something very emotional, very visceral. What it often boils down to in practice, especially in environments like Twitter, is a kind of just marginalized groups are good, majorities are bad, a kind of instinctive, a kind of instinct. So on one level, it's true there are contradictions in woke, and part of the woke attitude will say that Muslims are a marginalized group, and of course even more so depending on their ethnicity. Now, the other thing to bear in mind about the obvious fact that people do, of course, criticize and do more than criticize and actually condemn in completely unfair ways Muslims in the public sphere very frequently, is that this public sphere is not ruled wholly by woke. It's basically an attitude that affects the left side of the political spectrum. It's growing. So on the right, you will find people who generally, on the whole, criticize woke. And so the two things can coexist. A widespread culture of anti-Islam and anti-Muslim prejudice can coexist in the same society with a widespread problem of woke. One final point I'd make about this is that the woke tendency to view Muslims as a sacralized, marginalized group is also, of course, deeply problematic for Muslims, because it tends to view Muslims as the bearers of this kind of sacred identity that can be used or deployed to challenge the culture of the traditional majorities of Western countries. Now, it doesn't view Islam as actually a series or a system of ideas that could potentially be true, or at least worth taking seriously and thinking about. It doesn't really view it as a religious set of claims. It just views it as an identity that can be set in opposition to the oppressive white majority or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I mean, surely though, one might say, isn't there actually some good in woke ideology? Isn't it trying to correct long-term oppressive colonial structures, racist attitudes? Isn't that the taproot of it? And therefore, to criticize it, one risks appear to be extremely reactionary or even like Nazi. I mean, this word gets thrown around in a very kind of meaningless way, arguably, but nevertheless, isn't that the obvious response? This is based on a real cry for justice, and an anti-woke attitude is merely kind of a right-wing reactionary backlash with no real credibility.
Yes, sure. So, of course, on one level, it's true. Woke is trying to correct, in many cases, very real historical injustices that still have effects today. But it doesn't follow from that it's going about that process of recalibrating culture or correcting prejudice in a way that is, in any sense, laudable. So, depending on one's view, and I'm not going to say there's one correct view on how to deal with historical injustice here, but if one's view is that we should try to have a society in which race is not a factor, in which we just don't look at people's, the color of their skin, we judge the content of their character and so on, which has been common sense for a long time, woke is quite contrary to that idea. It also tends to overshoot in that because it is this emotional system that just has this simple heuristic of like majorities are bad and marginalized minorities are good, it tends to ignore any possible nuances. So, for instance, if someone is looking at the problems faced by African Americans in the United States, well, you can say, well, this is all due to structural racism, which the woke view is, but that doesn't really tell you very much. It doesn't really break down the detailed causes of ongoing inequalities and social problems. It's not a helpful framework for looking at the world just to say there's this black and, to use an unfortunate phrase, a black and white structure of oppression and hierarchy and no nuance in terms of causation and responsibility. Like, this doesn't really help anyone.
Yeah. I mean, can we just focus briefly on the role of woke in academia? Now, you're obviously at the University of Oxford doing your PhD. Can you just share with us what is the temperature like in these places? Is it red hot woke, or is it just kind of part of the background, not taken too seriously, or is it kind of quietly disdained? What's the temperature like in these places? Could you, for example, can Muslims generally express their views on sexuality and so on, with reasonable, moderate confidence, or are they forced to keep these beliefs about Islam quiet or not speak them openly for fear of retribution and being cancelled? What's going on?
So, that's a very good question. And I think that the first thing I should say is that universities are not completely monolithic, and also that a lot of the problems are mainly a result of peer pressure. So there's a very interesting report by Kaufman himself and also Tom Simpson, who's at Oxford, on academic freedom in the UK. And they found that even at the peak, when there were a lot of people getting cancelled and fired for having the wrong views, even at the peak, this was still a pretty small number compared to the total number of academics, as I suppose you would expect. But what was really a problem was just a culture of self-censorship. So you tended to find actually a majority of academics would oppose cancellation campaigns, or at least a plurality. There'd be a middle group that was sort of on the fence. But what you would find is that a larger number of people would just support socially ostracizing folk with the wrong views, refuse to have lunch with a gender critical, that is to say, someone who has the wrong view on transgender issues, for example. So this is actually, I think, a bigger problem. This is just quotidian peer pressure, social pressure that leads the majority of academics who don't identify with the political left to self-censor. Now, as for Muslims in academia specifically, I mean, this is a really interesting question, because I don't think that Muslims in academia are necessarily particularly likely to engage with controversial questions as Muslims. So a lot of Muslims are in the physical sciences, where these issues just don't come up much, and they can largely just be confined to one's private life. Of course, there are some Muslims in social and human sciences. I mean, if you're doing Islamic studies in a department that hires Muslims, then generally you can have your own Islamic views. That isn't going to be a cancelable offense, because it would be impossible to really take Islamic studies seriously if it was. If you're maybe in a so-called secular area of the humanities or social sciences, and there are not so many Muslims in these areas, but if you are, then I think you would face the same pressures that, for example, a conservative Christian academic would face. Right. Generally, my anecdotal observation is that Muslims in these areas adopt slightly different strategies. So they might, for instance, lean slightly into the Muslims as a sacralized minority aspect of woke as a means, I'm not suggesting they do this consciously, but as a means of just making it easier to identify both as a Muslim and as a secular progressive academic.
Gosh, so you're saying it depends on which the subject matter, hard sciences never going to come up.
Right.
But other people might need to be a bit cautious. Yeah, but the peer pressure seems to be a big factor here, isn't it? Rather than dictate them on high. So that's much more difficult to resist in a way. But do you feel that Muslims have freedom to be Muslims at Oxford or other places, or do they have to self-censor in practice? And do you feel there's a sense of keeping ideas not covert, but not openly talking about them? Not that there's anything wrong with the ideas. These are just traditional Islamic views, which are often very similar to traditional Catholic views, Orthodox views, or evangelical views. But do you think you get the sense that Muslims are self-censoring a lot?
So I would say, in terms of Muslims specifically, I think a bigger aspect of this is just that there are not that many Muslims going into the fields where they would have to self-censor if they were in those fields. And that may partly be because those fields are dominated by this particular set of attitudes where there's quite a narrow range of opinion that's acceptable. That's probably a factor in producing that tendency, because not many conservative Christians or just conservatives generally go into these fields either. So that you tend to have these self-selection effects, and they become quite powerful. I think that the bigger issue in academia, in a way, is because ultimately, a person who feels unhappy because someone doesn't want to have lunch with them, while we might think it's bad, it's not as though they're the victim of some immense injustice. Yeah. The bigger issue is just that when you don't have a diversity of viewpoints, academia itself suffers, and you don't have proper debate, you don't have the proper evaluation of arguments and evidence, you have a lot of groupthink, and you have this sort of narrow ideological conformist attitude that becomes quite a serious problem in a lot of areas of academia.
Yeah. So is woke actually a threat to religious freedom then, you think? I know you mentioned this legal move to ban so-called LGBT conversion therapy, but is it within the academy? Is it a threat to religious freedom?
Specifically in the academy?
Well, or generally, perhaps more generally in society, in Britain and the West.
Yes, I think that it is, yes. So I always like to refer, in fact, I have an article that touches on this coming out in Renovatio in a few weeks, but I would like to, so look out for that. But I always like to refer back to Abdul Hakim Murad's comments in his book, Traveling Home, about Islam in Europe, where so he says this is caused by a lot of the restrictions placed on Muslims are caused by what he calls coercive liberalism. So you will have the right wing promoting these restrictions. They will do so partly on the alleged grounds that Muslims are not liberal enough. Their criteria for deciding whether Muslims are liberal enough is going to be heavily informed increasingly by these.
Sorry, what I'm doing is I'm just looking at, you mentioned the book, and I just feel on about again. Look, this is a marvelous book, Abdul Hakim Murad, Traveling Home, Essays on Islam, and you've been out a couple of years now. You referenced it, and I really think it's a marvelous book. If you haven't already come across it, so sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, very insightful book. Yeah, but the criteria that are used for saying Muslims are not liberal enough is often that they don't have the right views on these sensitive gender and sexual issues. But then this comes from the cultural left, expanding or rather narrowing on the other side the range of which views are acceptable and tolerable on those issues. So in a broader sense, I think it's hard to sort of pinpoint specific laws and say like this law is woke. Like I don't think that's quite how it works. There's an underlying emotional attitude that makes certain trends more likely. It makes laws like the one we talked about conversion therapy more likely. It makes it more likely that hate speech is going to be interpreted a certain way, that freedom of association is going to be balanced against non-discrimination in a certain way. It just makes all of these particular political and legal judgments more likely to fall out one way because of the underlying emotional weight that they're given when these attitudes spread.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, the elephant in the room here, if I may call Donald Trump the elephant in the room, is precisely his election to be president of the United States. It's going to be become the actual president in January. And so he represents, in a quite extraordinary, powerful way, the pushback against woke. And in fact, I was just watching him on TikTok earlier on, where some clip was broadcast saying, the schools in America have been taken over by this dreadful woke ideology, and the federal government's going to do something about this, and we're going to withdraw funding from teachers who support critical race theory, LGBT, trans, and all this stuff. I mean, this guy is really explicitly targeting this ideology's grip, as he sees it, on American schools. And of course, it's not going to stop there. It's going to the federal government, the army, or the armed forces in America, and so on. So is this the great pushback? Are we finally seeing the pendulum, which has gone so to one extreme, moving back against that tendency? Are we seeing the counter-revolution in action now? Or do you think this is just a little blip in the inexorable rise of wokeism, which will ultimately become all-powerful and ubiquitous? Well, what's your take?
Yeah, so it's going to be somewhere in between. I don't like to say that anything is completely inexorable, but probably closer to that end of the spectrum than the other. So, of course, it's true that Trump very vocally, visibly repudiates woke in a number of ways, and he has said various things he intends to do about it. Now, I think if we look at the causes of the spread of woke attitudes, and again, Eric Kaufman has a lot of research on this, and there's a report he's done with Zach Goldberg for City Journal on school choice, where they show that it's extraordinarily effective, basically, when children are exposed to these woke attitudes about whatever it is, patriarchy, white supremacy, etc., in school, because they're generally exposed to these at a young age by authorities in a setting in which they can't really question them, and they're not told these are like ideas out there that you might accept or not. They're told this is the truth most of the time. They have a huge impact on children's future political views. And so you see this very strong generational shift. Now, it is true that a lot of young people voted for Trump. And it is true that the spread of woke basically takes place within the left-wing camp. So what you see is that if you look at a cross-section of both age and political alignment, you'll find that conservatives are about equally not woke, whatever age they are. You'll find that liberals or progressives, if they're boomers or older, are pretty much non-woke. But if they're Gen Z, they're mostly very woke. They have very different attitudes. They're maybe 5 or 10 times more likely to think that, for example, J.K. Rowling should have been dropped by her publisher, or that James Damore, who basically got fired from Google for saying men and women are different, was right to be fired. So you can have these two things happening at the same time. You can have pushback because a lot of people who are young are still on the right and vote for Trump, but those who are on the left are way more woke, and they're also the ones who are more likely to go to college and have more influential jobs in the future, because that tends to be, in many top professions now, they become progressive dominated. So my view is that on the whole, I think we're more likely to see this increase across generations. Trump might do something big on schools. On the other hand, if his second term turns out to be like his first, he may end up talking a lot and there being rather more heat than light. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's just like the famous, the wall, the barrier between Mexico and America. Right. The wall was never built, never completed anyway. But I just push back a little bit on this. I was just looking at the Guardian earlier, looking at the stats for men and women between the ages of 18 to 26 who voted for Trump in the presidential election. Apparently 56% of men between 18 and 29 voted for Trump, and 40% of females did. But 50% is a majority. I mean, this means if this is consistent in terms of their support of Trump and his policies, which I kind of assume it is, that most young people in the States are anti-woke. Does it not follow?
Right, but that's actually consistent with this increasing very sharply across generations. Because if you polled like over 70s, you'd find they were overwhelmingly anti-woke, even if they're rabid Democrats. Right. Although they tend not to really understand it or know what's going on. So there's still this generational shift, I'm afraid, and then that's the thing that is worrying. So you could have a society where 30-40% of people are very strongly woke, and those people might be disproportionately wealthy, influential, and involved in creative and academic fields. And that would be a society that might end up being pretty woke dominated.
Interesting. So you're quite pessimistic. I'm actually quite optimistic, actually, because I think I've got this kind of perhaps naive idea, but I think that the fitra, this innate disposition we have as a species implanted by God, this human nature, will ultimately reassert itself in a healthy way. And the analogy that I have is like the rise of the Soviet man in Russia in 1917. Where there was a conscious attempt to create this Soviet man, a new kind of human being. We would be socialist or communist, and relate differently from the previous, greedy, individualistic capitalist way. Because all baloney, the Soviet man didn't exist. And now Russia, of course, is very religious again. They're all going back to church, which is infinitely better than being a communist, of course. So I think there's a reassertion of our natural disposition there. And we saw that in Germany in the 30s and so on. So I suspect this kind of ideology is so ludicrous in some of its aspects that ultimately it will go out of fashion because people would just think, well, this is baloney, really. Does that hold water for you at all?
I mean, I hope that you're right. However, one of my worries is that the human desire to have a god, to view something as sacred, I think can misfire and can be attached to things that are not only theologically imperfect, but things that are just heinous and awful. And I think a lot of woke draws on that instinct. I think it draws on that desire to view our political life as sacred or reflecting sacred values. It draws on the desire to have some moral absolutes, just in a very perverse way. So that's a concern, and I think that of course, the historical record also bears out that entire societies can and have systematically oriented themselves around ideas that were morally heinous and empirically false. This is not this darker element of human nature is not alien to history either.
I think you're right. I mean, it's interesting that Kaufman's book is called, the Third Awakening? And of course, there's a play on words, the Third Awakening. And I actually had to check on ChatGPT, what is this Third Awakening? And the result wasn't very clear. So it can refer to religious kind of revivals in the United States in the 18th or 19th centuries. This would be like the third phase of another Christian revival kind of thing. So he's drawing on that idea, perhaps. But I think what it does communicate is a sense of the religious component, the quasi-religious component of woke. It's not just a secular ideology. It actually meets a profound religious need, which you've already mentioned, to have meaning and purpose and a transcendent goal, the refashioning of society in this woke utopian manner. So I think it does, fill that gap, that lacuna in our Western consciousness, given that religion has retreated now to the private domain or even to no domain at all in the West. But that leaves the other great reality, the great opposition to this, I would suggest, is Islam itself. I mean, as a global reality, as the fastest growing religion, a religion that is confident, it knows itself, it is not compromised at all in the way that Christianity sadly has with secular ideology, whether it be liberalism, this kind of coercive liberalism, or other kinds of weird ideologies which have completely mostly subverted Christianity, I would say. But Islam doesn't appear to have been affected to that degree at all, do you think?
Well, this is a big issue, and I don't like to speculate too much about these massive long-term global trends. But my knowledge of the religious sociology and the causes of religious change generally across the world is pretty limited. But it's certainly plausible enough, I think, that you might be right, that we might be moving more towards a world where you have a highly woke or whatever West. You have a Muslim world that largely resists this, and maybe you have some other areas that are somewhat in between, but on the same trajectory as the West. I mean, that's plausible. How we would view societies like China is an interesting question, because I don't think that they're going woke in any way. They are also deeply secular, more secular than the West in a number of ways. So Russia,
Eastern Europe, and they've got a great block. Russia's another one. Russia, China, the two other mega powers in the world. I think the United States gone woke, and then you have Russia, which is China, which is not, and then you have many countries in the Far East and the Eastern Europe. These are the axis of resistance, to borrow that term, in a different way, aren't they? They're not just rolling over and saying, let's all let's go woke. They're not doing that.
Well, this is very interesting. I think there's a sense. There's two things I would say about these societies in Eastern Europe. So one of them is that although there was, I think, a very genuine Christian revival at the end of the Cold War, I think it was stronger at the level of political symbolism than at the level of social reality. So you had a modest increase in church attendance. Putin claims to be the global champion of Christian values. Russia has the world's highest abortion rate. it's not entirely clear this is really sort of a lived reality on a deep level in Russia. I think there's also evidence, if you look at the surveys that have been done of younger generations in these societies. This includes Poland, which until a few years ago was part of I think 2 years ago was part of this sort of Christian revival on a political level. It includes Viktor Orban's Hungary, which is the one that is currently fated by these post-liberal Christian intellectuals. You see secularization taking place there nearly as quickly as it is in Western Europe among the younger cohorts who are apparently rejecting the sort of cultural or nominal Christianity that their society officially upholds. So they might end up going in the same direction in the very long run.
Yeah, but Islam, though, I get this as the sense is not going down that path in the same way. So just there's another kind of curious phenomena which I know you've noticed, and I've noticed it too, and that is the promotion by Israel or Zionist apologists of kind of woke ideologies. It's kind of like the woke right, if you like. Look at Israel. Israel's this island of LGBT tolerance. It supports gay pride, whatever, in the Middle East, and this is seen as something that to be approved of and to be praised, and another reason to protect Israel, of course, in its ongoing wars and genocide. But how significant is this woke right phenomena? It's not just to the left. You'd be saying so far it's a left phenomena, but surely is also found, curiously, in the right, in this kind of promotion of Zionism as a virtuous ideology.
Yeah, this is very, very interesting. And I would just make, firstly, the slightly technical point that this discourse that I think was called pinkwashing, of like portraying Israel as this great country because it's very progressive on LGBT issues, that isn't quite the same thing as woke, although it can feed into it. Because, I mean, woke appears to have started around 2014, 15. We introduced same-sex marriage in Britain in 2013. That was pre-woke. So you can have a progressive view on that issue, whatever one thinks of it, without being woke, because you don't view it as, you just view it as a sort of liberal justice, or in a secular way, rather than a sacred identity. But the bigger issue here, I think, what's going on, especially in the last year, is that you've seen a number of people on the pro-Israel right adopt certain woke tropes in a quite perhaps selective way. It's particularly apparent in things someone like Douglas Murray, who, ironically enough, has an entire book attacking woke identity politics, in which he has this quote which goes something like, the victim is not always right or morally good, doesn't deserve to be automatically believed, and may not always be a victim. And yet, on the other side, he will then, when discussing Israel or issues affecting the Jewish community, essentially adopt the tactic of portraying the Jewish community as a sacralized, marginalized group, which is woke. So, this extraordinary interview where he actually says, I'm summarizing this, but he says that because of the amazing persecution that Jews have faced in the past, which of course is true, that the death of Jews is a greater tragedy than the death of Christians or Muslims.
I saw that. Extraordinary. Jacob, what I don't understand about Douglas Murray, a fellow Englishman like us, this guy is an atheist. This guy is gay. This is how the language he uses. He doesn't believe in God. Why is he sacralizing Jewish people? What the hell's going on with it? I mean, there seems to be no obvious reason why he would do this from position as an atheist Englishman. Why is he allying himself so fanatically? And he really is a spokesman for the worst excesses, arguably, of Zionism on behalf of Israel. I mean, he's feted by the president of Israel, the photo opportunities. Where is this guy? But he's obviously popular. His books are translated into many European languages and other languages. He's read by very influential people across Europe and elsewhere. He's a big player. And yet I don't quite understand why he's so obsessed with this. Is it ultimately, and this is my suspicion, I may be wrong, that behind all this is his absolute hatred for Islam and also for God? I mean, he really, for him, that is the nemesis of all that is good and decent and Western is Islam. Of course, represents it's the ultimate religion of God, isn't it? Islam it means submission to God, and he, as a gay atheist, really can't stand that. And so, anything that opposes that is automatically, my enemy, the friend of my enemy's enemy is my friend, and that may explain for some reason why this guy, unpromisingly, is such a passionate advocate for Zionism. I mean, I just don't see it otherwise.
Well, I mean, tend to adopt the sort of English attitude of avoiding making windows into men's souls, so I won't speculate too much as to Douglas Murray's soul and what's really motivating him psychologically. But what I think we can say, well, actually, one thing that he has said is that he has asserted that if Israel were to collapse, the United States would immediately follow. Now, that seems like quite... Yes, that's what he said.
I thought it was the other way around. If the United States was collapsed, Israel would collapse.
He said that if Israel collapses, the United States will also fall. Now, it's quite a strange claim to make on a sort of descriptive level, but I think the wider thing that's going on here, and of course there's the element of just resentment or hatred of Islam, and that does exist, but the thing we can perhaps analyze in relation to woke is that there is this language of emotional vulnerability, and so you'll actually see when people are criticizing, for example, pro-Palestine protests on the grounds that they're allegedly anti-Semitic, they will use these very expansive definitions of what constitutes anti-Semitism. They will imply that anything that affects the so-called emotional safety of Jewish people is anti-Semitic. And this is just a mirror image of the same logic that they repudiate when applied to other minorities. So now, are some people just off doing this in bad faith? Probably. Are some people just unaware of the contradiction? Yes, probably. Do others have very complex ways of reconciling the two and making them consistent? Yes, they do. But you can definitely say that there is a woke tendency or a use of woke ideas by some of the movements to censor pro-Palestinian speech.
Yeah, no, this quote about not having windows into men's soul comes from Elizabeth I, I think, of England,
yes.
When it was to do with the whole Protestant Catholic, thing, and she wanted outward conformity, but she wasn't going to inquisitorially say, "Are you a true believer in the Elizabethan settlement" or whatever. She didn't say that. No, she wasn't going to have windows into men's souls. But someone like Douglas Murray, though, is so idiosyncratic and strange in some ways, given his public statements about who he is. I think one can ask about his motivation. I think Elizabeth had a slightly different thing going on there, but I'm less charitable than you, I think.
Well, look, I'm not saying we can't ever ask about his motivation. I'm just saying that with the kind of analysis I'm doing, for me, I don't think I'm qualified to understand his psychology, and I'm not sure it would help me.
I don't, any of us are. Yeah, I mean, there is a mystery about people, but nevertheless, I do have my suspicions. I just want to change tack completely, if I may, and that is to mention, as you indeed told me, about an extraordinary experience you had at Oxford University in censorship that was reported in the Daily Mail some time ago. And I'm just going to put it up on the screen so we can all see what the Daily Mail said about this and about you. Can you see it? Yep.
Yes, I can.
Thanks. So this is the Mail Online, obviously, Friday, December 22nd. Oh, that's today's date. So ignore that. This came out some time ago, published in 2015. Oxford University in censorship row as police seize copies of offensive student magazine. Editor Jacob Williams, your good self, said he was stopped distributing magazines. The magazine's founders said it was devoted to the concept of freedom of speech. Jacob tried to distribute the magazine at a freshers' fair at Oxford Uni. Thames Valley Police responded to a complaint by the Students' Union. And there is a picture of your younger self saying that you feared you're going to be arrested after your magazine was seized. And this is that the cover, is it? No offense.
A quite unfortunate in-joke at the time, because some of the anti-freedom people would refer to free speech as freeze peach. It was intended to be a frozen peach, but it's really quite silly.
Hence the peach thing. I couldn't quite get what was going on there. This is Williams 21, a PPE, politics, philosophy and economics student at Exeter College, said officers told him that handing out the magazine may constitute a public order offence. Oxford University and the Student Union have declined to comment on the censorship controversy. But anyway, at the end of the day, apparently this whole thing was dropped, and no further action was taken. But what on earth's going on there? What did you do, and why did it happen?
Well, this was really when this woke movement had started, and it was very visible that it started quite suddenly, and the statistics bear this out too. But it started quite quickly around 2014 to 2015. And so after about a year of this and seeing debates shut down, and of course it began at universities where I was, I was profoundly frustrated and disappointed with what was happening. I thought that a university of all places should be a place where you can freely discuss ideas. And so this magazine was intended to provoke debate by essentially violating all of the intellectual taboos. So it had pieces expressing the wrong views on gender, I can't remember everything that was published. I mean, it even had an anti-Islam piece. I wasn't Muslim at the time, and we published anything that appeared to be likely to offend those who are woke. It had pieces on abortion, on colonialism, on other issues. So the point of this was just to kind of break taboos and get people to actually engage with ideas. There were those who would say we need to have more free speech. They would engage in big debates about free speech. I thought that was rather pointless. I wanted to avoid this kind of second-order meta-level argument and actually just go and exercise free speech and go and discuss the issues they said you couldn't discuss. So we tried to hand this out outside the Freshers' Fair, which is the standard sort of way of distributing materials for a student society. Yeah. The student union authorities, who tend to be some of the most woke people in the world, said that the magazine is going to be offensive and that it couldn't be distributed. They withdrew any permission to hand it out. So we
called the police. Wasn't there some guy who called the police? Sorry, it's an extraordinary story. Extraordinary story.
Yeah, absolutely right. So we instead went outside the Freshers' Fair and just handed out the magazine in the street. Now, someone from the Students' Union called the police and said that the magazine contained hate speech. I happen to know that I won't talk about the individual, but I did happen to know that person and that they had some very, very bizarre and distasteful views. But they said that the magazine was hate speech. The police now, generally the police are not woke. Like generally the police, your average police officer is not an expert in the law, right? I mean, that's not actually their specialty to understand the nuances of free speech law. So they turn up not really knowing what's going on. If someone said there's something offensive that might have broken the law being handed out, they take a look at the magazine. Now, I think what actually happened was that I was away from the stand for a moment when they turned up. They took the magazines away to the police station to review them. Wow. They eventually concluded, after I think a number of days, that no crime had been committed. Now, it is important to stress, actually, that, generally, much as some sections of the right who are anti-woke tend to say, these hate speech laws are shutting down freedom of speech, it's not really true. Julian Rivers has done a lot of good research on this, and he's shown that these laws against hate speech haven't really changed much in their interpretation for 30, 40 years. Woke is mostly a problem of social censorship, not legal censorship. But in any case, the police looked at this, they said nothing had been done, they gave the magazines back, but of course, by that point, it was too late. So we didn't get a chance to distribute them with the Freshers' Fair. And that really led to what you see there.
Right, it's extraordinary. And you look much younger there. No offense, There we go. You can look it up online, obviously, if you want to read more about it. So how are things at Oxford now? I mean, have things calmed down? Is this no longer an issue? If you were to produce, could you produce a magazine? Not that you would now. You're Muslim now, of course. Some of those things you wouldn't subscribe to. But could someone produce a magazine like that in 2024/25 and get away with it, or is it simply impossible now at Oxford?
I would say this is only going to be a rough estimate, but I would say things right now it's probably slightly easier to do this than it was in the past. I think what has happened is that, and this is in some ways an unintended but positive development, is that after October 7th in last year, after the attempts by the pro-Israel movements to shut down the left and the often hypocritical stances that some took, many people on the cultural left have sort of rowed back on their own attempts to censor their opponents because they've realized these same languages can be deployed against them. There's been a calming down in that respect. I think there's also been there has been political pushback. In fact, Eric Kaufmann himself was involved in drafting a bill which the previous Conservative government in Britain passed to try to force universities and students' unions to uphold freedom of speech. Sadly, it was suspended by the current government, but there has been this greater pressure placed on universities. Oxford, for example, rewrote their entire policy on freedom of speech because of this bill. That new policy still stands. It hasn't been revised after the bill was suspended.
And this is a good thing. So I was asking what should be done about woke. So this is part of a piecemeal readjustment of the terrain to bring about some balance, perhaps?
Yes. I mean, in terms of what can be done It depends who we're talking about, who's supposed to do it. But the current government in Britain isn't particularly interested in the issue either way. What can be done, I think, on the ground individually is for people who are, especially at universities where this tends to be the most serious and I think also very consequential because these are the centres that generate ideas. People can organise. People who are opposed to this kind of narrow range of opinions can organise. They can get together. They can discuss readings that go against the received views. They can produce publications. They can do all of these things, and they will run up to opposition sometimes. Probably less so than 3 or 4 years ago, but ultimately, I think that it is piecemeal, and I think that the positive change comes from pressing up against those limits and pushing a little further each time until you've corrected the problem.
And as not the people like Elon Musk, of course, it's taking over Twitter now, X, which is now pretty much a free for all. I mean, there are some limits, but there were under the old regime. I mean, now you got a lot of anti-woke stuff, not censored. And Twitter is like a global platform. So this is hugely consequential, isn't it, in this anti-woke movement?
Well, it's interesting. So I don't have the full story on this. I think Musk may have said he was going to censor certain pro-Palestine slogans. So there is a sense in which I think some of what Musk does might be an example of the right-wing opposition to woke. I mean, this is not a generalization about the entire right wing, but some on the right, certainly who are opposed to woke, are not as keen to protect the free speech of those they dislike, particularly right now on the Israel-Palestine issue. So are we seeing a general restoration of free speech? I mean, I don't think the left or the right is inherently more or less censorious than the other. There has been a particular problem from the left in the last 10 years or so. Twitter is important, but it's only one platform. So generally, my view is still the trend is towards greater awakening. But this is a very long-term tendency. It's not a prediction for the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Well, finally, can we just talk about books you might recommend? Is there a particular book if people want to read more about this topic? What would you suggest?
Well, yeah, I would suggest, of course, looking at Eric Kaufmann's book, in Britain, it's called Taboo: How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. In America, it's The Third Awakening. This is, and of course, it's why I chose to review the book, one of the most comprehensive on the topic. It evaluates all the arguments by other authors. So looking at those that he refers to, the authors he cites there would be another way to get into this more deeply. He's also produced an online course run by the University of Buckingham, which anyone can pay a small fee to access, where you can sort of engage with this in a more interactive way. Right.
So this is your review, but it mentions The Third Awakening, Eric Kaufmann, published 2024. But that's the American version. The English version is called something else, confusingly, The Taboo. But that's available on Amazon, is it?
Yes, it is.
It is. Great. Well, I think I'm definitely going to have to get a copy of that, as you recommend it so highly. Any concluding thoughts you'd like to share with us about this whole woke madness?
I think I would just say that it's important for everyone, but it's important for Muslims who may sometimes see woke as somehow either irrelevant or sympathetic to Muslim interests, to realize that it isn't necessarily, that actually this can be a threat to Muslims in the West, to basic religious liberties that are very important. And the fact that many of those who are anti-woke might have views we dislike on other issues doesn't mean that we can't make strategic alliances there.
Yes, I think the greatest tonic or the greatest solution to this for us as Muslims is simply to read the Quran. I mean, it's an extraordinary book, obviously, and is a great way of detoxifying oneself of these noxious ideas. But yeah, thank you very much indeed, Jacob, for your time. Fantastic to see you again. I do hope one day you'll come back. You mentioned this article going in the Zaytuna House publication. Maybe next year, inshallah, I'll come back and talk about that. But thank you very much for your time, and take care. Until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, Paul. It's been great to be here. Thank you again.